Welcome, everybody. We are all grateful to the Satyajit Film Society in Bengaluru for having given us this opportunity to share notes on Mrinal Sen. Right at the beginning, I must put something on record and a feeling that all three of us share, and we have been sharing for the last few hours that we have been together here this time. Very old friends of mine, both of them, Adoor and Manu, is that we don't believe in all this politics of one nation, one language, one culture, one future. The joy, the pride, the ecstasy, I would say, of being an Indian is that we are so plural. We have so many points of view that would clash, that we can share, and we grow in the process, and that's the way we express ourselves. And that is what Mrinal Sen represented all his life. Chandril, speaking the other day, spoke of Mrinal Sen as somebody who was never predictable, who moved from one point to another, never tried to put across that he had a single program, a single agenda, a single point of view. He grew with the times and developed with the times. So we shall be having this session in that spirit, the spirit of plurality, of bringing into our reading of Mrinal Sen's films different historical experiences, different cultures, different languages even, with their own nuances. And it's a joy to have Adoor from Kerala and Manu from Bengaluru itself to share with us their readings, their responses to Mrinal, from which we learn. And right at the end, I'll also try to share my readings, somebody who has known him, interacted with him for years at a stretch, beginning from the Akash Kushum days. So with that, I'd ask Adoor to begin.
There's no stand, you have a stand?
You have a lectern?
Where you can keep this mic, instead of holding it. It doesn't. No, there's nothing like that. Huh?
lectern নেই পোডিয়ামটা আমরা আগে ইউজ করেছি
I stand with the mic. Of course, I of course have my own stand. Manarda very often referred to the term controversy, and he used to say, I welcome a controversy because the controversy inevitably leads to the truth. It inevitably leads to the truth. But then it is not always so. Not always so. No, don't worry. I'll keep it closer. Please don't worry. I can't help being personal when I talk about Manarda. I always loved and respected him as my elder brother, who was keenly interested in me and my work. He had the freedom to guide me advised me and also admonished me whenever he thought I had made a mistake, minor or major. I had always sought his opinion about every film that I made at long intervals. Fortunately for me, he was always appreciative, encouraging, never ever critical. In a sense, he was indulgent with me. I was fortunate to get his affection. Gidadi, his charming wife, used to say, "We are family." I am aware Minalda had to struggle a lot to get the critical attention he deserved. The world knew one Satyajit Ray, and it was as if they did not care to take note of another maverick from this country. The same way as we are averse to hear about a filmmaker from Sweden other than Bergman. Puvenshom made in 1969 won the National Award for the Best Film, Breaking the Impasse, and he got the right Philip to continue his journey with confidence. In fact, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in his career. This film, based on Banapul's story, in this film he used commentary, stop motion, stills, animation, and all of it to alienate an audience wanting to follow a story in the normal way. I did not like the film much when I saw it first. Recently, I watched it. Recently, as just 3 days back, I watched it again and I enjoyed it thoroughly. So the problem was mine, not the film's. Uh, he embraced anyway. The film became a landmark in Indian cinema with its totally fresh approach to filmmaking. It boldly bid goodbye to conventional narrative styles and embraced unabashedly experimentation. Puvanshom also marked the beginning of the new Indian cinema. It is a little known fact that in the late 60s, some of us, Basu Chatterjee, Arun Kaul, he was a script writer in Bombay, and myself, to name a few, had got together in Bombay under the leadership of Manalda and gave shape to an initiative called New Cinema Movement. We denounced the old cinema and vowed to play the harbinger's role in welcoming an offbeat cinema new in every respect. A page-long statement was prepared in the same style and mode as the famous declaration made by the young German filmmakers at the Oberhausen Film Festival. His long and impressive career can be seen in three phases. One, the first, of struggles and ideological compulsions. Two, the middle one, his most creative period when all the major works were made. It is notable for his introspective approach to cinema and a delineation of life unconditionally and truthfully. The third and the last phase is not as exciting as the earlier ones. We all get old, this happens. People keep telling me, "Oh, we like your earlier films." I feel sad. Whereas I feel happy about my latest. This is a dialogue that keeps on going. Uh, One notices a playful, tongue-in-cheek Sen in most films. He must have enjoyed poking those jokes at others as well as himself. Once, in a pensive mood, he told me, "You have never made a wrong step. In my case, I have made several." Of so many films he has made, my favorite one is Ek Din Pratidin. Interestingly, this film epitomizes everything he had stood for. Next to it come Kharij, Calcutta 71, Akaler Santani, and a couple of other films. Humor is an inseparable element that savors his films. It invariably emanates from characters and situations. Even the most grim situations are lit up by the humor that is neither slapstick nor funny. The courtroom sequence in Mrigaya is a case in point. A tribal youth is being tried in a law court in Calcutta for the murder of a white man. In the grime summer heat of the courtroom, the whirring fan above the honorable judge grinds to a halt with a pitiable squeak. The perspiring judge turns around and looks up at the fan in pangs, his expression turning pitiable. Following him, the vociferous counsel, as well as the officials present, look up helplessly, and the accused tribal look up at the fan too, and which has already turned still by now. This unforgettable scene is a comment on the frequent power cuts in Calcutta, which has become notorious for it. It also pokes a joke at the farcical trial, the outcome of which is plainly predictable. It was in the fifth. It was in the film Chorus uh, that an entrepreneur. Uh, Actually, I was a member of the jury, national jury, when Chorus came in for competition, and we gave the best award to this film. And it was in this film Chorus that an entrepreneur discovers a brilliant solution to deal with the excessive number of applicants for the very few jobs on offer. As it is impossible to give them all jobs, the boss instructs his deputy to issue everyone with application forms generously and make them happy. Having lived a simple and austere life, Manalda always stood with the man in the street. While being pro left, he never cared to become a member of any political party. That would impinge upon his creative freedom as a free artist, he believed. Neither his professional nor his personal life was ostentatious. A person of high intellectual and artistic integrity, he would never swerve from his lofty ideals. I remember him once saying, "Tell me a person's lifestyle. I can tell you the kind of films he would make." He enjoyed talking and would invariably attract attentive listeners around him wherever he is, and particularly at the gatherings of like minded people. Right from Bhuvan Shom to Amar Bhuvan, the last film he made, Mrinalda never stopped being innovative. His boldness marks him apart from the other two of the great Trinity. I personally call him the third of the Trinity. He has never fought shy of experimenting with the form of cinema. In a way, like Godard, he was reshaping cinema to give it another look and feel. At times, one may feel they were crazy too. I remember in one of his films, he projected the soundtrack on the screen. Such topsy turvy experiments are likely to estrange an audience unable to comprehend it. He was not unsure of it either. He was not unaware of it either. In later years, he came around to an evolved film language of his own that was intelligible to the audience at large. His engagement with cinema was personal and passionate. I think that made him very different from the run of the mill filmmakers. Bernarda's advice to students at the Film Institute was to watch films, think films, speak films, and dream films to become filmmakers themselves. Thank you.
It's Thank you, Adoor. Thank you, Adoor. It's now the turn of Dr. N Manu Chakravarthy. Manu has chosen 10 films by Mrinal Sen. He has chosen 10 films by Mrinal Sen and he has structured them into a presentation. So, welcome, Manu.
Good evening, friends. Shamikda Adoorji. Well, as Shamikda mentioned, I have taken 10 films, but I'll only try to make a conceptual presentation, trying to highlight what I think are very significant features and also central features in Mrinal's films. This was mentioned in passing by Sri Adoor, that he was ideological, political, but was not trapped in specific reductionist dominant ideologies. In fact, I tried to show through certain films, certain details, how he was really taking very, very difficult, very intransigent positions. And that I think is very crucial when we try to understand Mrinal. The second is, I think, now, very interesting that his themes, thematic concerns, they run quite close to Satyajit Ray, but very different. In fact, I'll try to show whenever possible that there are these overlaps, common concerns, but it needs to be stated quite emphatically that these two are very different filmmakers. So I think they had what I would characterize as an asymptotic relationship. They were two asymptotes, which means if they ever meet, they meet perhaps in infinity, the point of infinity. I'll begin with, I'm not going to be chronological, I'm not going to be linear, which is not necessary. So I go by my appreciation of the themes Mrinal handled in his works. I begin with the Telugu film, Oka Uri Katha. This is important because these are days when we talk of pan-Indian films. Very vacuous, hollow. There's nothing there about the pan-Indian. But look at a Bengali filmmaker coming to the Telugu world, opening up certain conceptions. Now I talk of not just conceptual frames, these are my conceptual frames, but he worked with concepts. And what was he trying to do? It's very important. And this film is marked by very, very crucial and very unexpected subversions. The first is, and I also try to show, it's my attempt to show that very, very standard and very codified notions of Marxism are broken by Mrinal. Ideological, leftist in attitude, in orientation, but certainly not trapped by ideological frames. There's a certain kind of dynamism here, which is what I'm trying to point out. The whole reference to labor to begin with in the film, that the protagonist, the old man, subverts the whole notion of labor by saying labor is exploitative. So he chooses not to work. It's lethargy, it's sloth. Now, this is not the standard understanding of labor as something that gives dignity, but the protagonist from within the text of the film argues that labor is only a form of exploitation, so I shall not work. In fact, the subversion of labor in the film is a form of protest, because if you labor as a subaltern, as somebody exploited, you only make the rich richer, the exploiter gain greater strength to crush you. Now, these, I suggest, are subversive patterns in Mrinal's films, and it topples, these patterns topple our standard, regularized, standardized intellectual constructions, because they come from existential locations. We are dealing with peasants, very poor people, father and son, but the point is there's a certain subversion, there's an inversion of the principle of labor. So through the text, the textual frames, Mrinal is pointing out at a certain kind of existential rebellion. But an existential rebellion that eventually is not going to be defended, justified. Now, that's why the entire structure of the film is built on great contradictions, paradoxes. But certainly the resorting, the attempt to take refuge in saying, I shall not work, because by my work, somebody, the exploiter, the oppressor will profit. There's also a reference to theft, and very interestingly, now this is the dialectical relationship Mrinal Sen establishes with Marx. There is theft in the film. I'm not going to trace the whole plot of the film, which is unnecessary, redundant. So Marx's classic statement was theft is also a form of class war. And here is Mrinalda, without resorting to mere theoretical statements, shows the man thieving. And this theft is a form of class war. But what is interesting is when we look at these patterns of somebody oppressed, the oppressed, trying to subvert regular patterns, the question of gender violence is built, crafted into the plot of the film. And this is where Mrinalda structures his film at two levels. One at the socio-economic political level, where the man who is crushed refuses to participate in the production of wealth, which only enhances the wealth of the oppressor. But this is woven into the other texture of the daughter-in-law, and this gender question is very central in all films made by Mrinalda. So if on one hand we notice rebellion, a form of protest, by the oppressed, this oppressed protesting becomes the oppressor in relation to the daughter-in-law. So Mrinal Sen is creating a situation where he weaves in socio-cultural political matrices with this question of gender, where the daughter-in-law pays with her life, pregnant. So what do we make of this paradox, of this duality, of this contradiction, where the oppressed protests, but the oppressed individual himself becomes the oppressor? So the structures of exploitation in our society are not very simple and cannot be understood through simplistic reductionist ideological schemes. In another sense, to push this point further, it only means that standard types of the leftist kind, which cannot understand questions of caste. Caste is built into this film. So there is no mere class struggle without an equal understanding, without equal emphasis being placed on gender stereotypes, caste stereotypes, and class stereotypes. So the Indian reality, the Indian realities as it was. Now, these realities are structured around patterns of life, social, cultural, economic, and political, which are inextricably bound with each other, connected to each other. And this is where Vakavuri Katha tells the story of one place, a Telugu film, and the protagonist is a Kannada protagonist who also played Choma in Chomanadudi. Now, this is a pan-Indian film in the true sense because it's grounded in a specific reality, it's grounded in a specific context, not this hollow, empty pan-Indian, which is neither Indian, nor global, nor local, nor universal. So we need to redefine these terms, which have become very fashionable terms, only because of the success at the box office, 300 crores, 400 crores, as if money is the criterion. The second film I turn to is the earlier film, Bhuvan Shom, 1969. Now there are two layers, major layers in the film. One is the ludic element. Now, if we are not careful, this ludic element, high mimetic mode, exaggeration, is actually something that works to lampoon, ridicule. It's a kind of playful buffoonery where Bhuvan Shom is made fun of. Here is the master. Here is the big boss, the bureaucrat, sitting in judgment over an ordinary ticket collector. But through this ticket collector, who is corrupt, who is supposed to take bribes, which is going to be redefined by his wife later on when Bhuvan Shom wants to go hunting, visits the village, the interiors. I would say that the form to understand Bhuvan Shom is to understand the content through the form of the film. Comical, ridiculous, humorous, through which we turn to the pathetic story of Bhuvan Shom, cynical, hard-hearted, arrogant, has made his wife suffer. And it's a man who is empty, who is dark, goes through phases of darkness and does not understand the complexities of life. Through this mode, the ludic mode, the humor part of Bhuvan Shom, it works at a very serious metaphysical level in the sense that we begin to understand this man who is strict, everybody is afraid of him. So the juxtaposition of the comical with the serious, with his own metaphysical crisis, is one part of the film. The second part of the film for me is very interesting because I think, going by my reading, this is my subjective reading, and if you watch the film, you may share. There may be the possibility of sharing my position. The second part of the film for me is an important contestation of the kind of ridiculous sweeping statement that Marx made on rural India, describing India as, or such societies, the term we use, third world societies, backward societies, primitive societies, as areas of oriental despotism, village idiocy. These are the conventional stereotypes. So the British had to come here. We had to move from feudalism to middle class liberalism to capitalism, and then there will be socialism. But if you look at Gauri, the female protagonist, now for me, Mrinal Sen is doing something unconventionally beautiful. She is innocent, pure, absolutely pure, simple, with her own understanding of the world, of nature, of hunting for that matter. So one is the juxtaposition which borders on the ludic, the homo ludens element, playful, through which we enter the sad, drab inner world of Bhuvan Shom. These find a third contrast, a third juxtaposition with Gauri, very innocent, very pure, and this leads us to another metaphysical position, and that is through Gauri, this dry, desiccated Bhuvan Shom begins to understand that there is more to life through kindness, through empathy, through love. And this is the collapse, in a sense, the spiritual collapse of Bhuvan Shom, who now begins to rebuild his life, reconstruct his life. So if you want to have a fine, enjoyable time with Bhuvan Shom, it offers you that. But if you pass through the comical mode, the mode of humor, you begin to see that it has other dimensions. So this very careful crafting, juxtaposition, unearths, helps emerge multiple very complex schemes. And that's why for me, Bhuvan Shom, to understand Bhuvan Shom is through its form. And if we just look at the content, if we trace the plot, we do not understand these very complex juxtapositions. The next film I will take up is Calcutta 71 in 5 segments. The first one, Adoorji has pointed out, of the courtroom scene, again, very, very overdone, high mimetic. But the other 4 stories are about suffering, state of Calcutta, state of India, and in the most open, critical manner, we will come to that later in Padatik, but you will see the entire reality of India as a nation going through misery, suffering, exploitation, labor unions collapsing, of factionalism, of political leaders being murdered. All these are woven into this. So if on one hand, we look at the history of modern India, post-independence India, again, in an unfailing manner, Mrinalda has to return to the stories of women. And that's where the question of gender is foregrounded when you look at the stories of a mother pushing her girl into prostitution. That's one of the segments of Calcutta 71. So if we look at larger historical frames, political, social, economic, the marginalization of women, Who then is going to tell the stories of women? What about the crises, the several crises that women face as human beings, because they are not part of modern history? Now, modern histories exclude women. Mrinal Das' vision is such that they become integral to his understanding of history, to his sense of history. And the spectacle of a mother who eventually breaks down when you go to the last part of that segment, the daughter's asking, young girl being asked to go as a prostitute, if that's the word, as a call girl, whichever word. But the point is, stories of nations, stories of civilizations cannot be told independent of the existential struggles, sufferings, miseries of women. And the last part, there are two more parts. The one part is of children, the futureless state of children into smuggling, harassed by police. But then you will also see that there is a glimmer of hope in this section on, which is very different from, I'm reminded of Buñuel's film, Los Olvidados, and several films made with children, brutal, violent, as if there is no future. But the kind of faith that Mrinal has as far as history is concerned, future is concerned, is that you begin to see possibilities of a new kind of India, if not a new kind of India, of societies in their own decentered locations. There being the possibility, not to suggest it as a historical certainty, but as the possibility of a new future, perhaps, without which a work of art is a contradiction in terms. As Camus said, a work of art of despair is a contradiction in terms. So we look for a rays of light, some streak of some better future. Leave it at that, suggest. And what emerges in the film is what we come to in Padatik, one of the great lines in the film, not as a statement, not as a declaration, not as an ideological label, but out of the images of suffering, violence, police brutality, retaliation, this line appears. In spite of all this misery, a language of protest, I'm quoting from the film, a language of protest is emerging from the depth of death. So the presence of death, confronting death, brutality, out of which a language, it's a mere language, will it lead to a different future? It's left open. Because choices of history are going to be made by people who come into the future or emerge from the future. Look at Padatik. There isn't a single 1973, just before the emergency. Look at all those references to Green Revolution, strikes all over, power failures all over, power shutdown, load shedding all over, Tamil Nadu collapse. This is pan-Indian. When you're making a film in a certain area, specific area, when you're making a film within a certain territory, the territory opens up to other territories. So the geopolitical expanse is located at a specific point, but it opens up. So when you're dealing with the present, you move into the past, you move into the future. There's no sense of the present without an understanding of the past or the future. So this is cyclical manner in which Padatik operates. And look at this, if you contrast it with Satyajit Ray's, his city stories. Go to Mahanagar, Pratidwandi, and when you look at the states of women, condition of women, you cannot forget Janaranya. So as if they were making films together, but in different styles, different modes. The preoccupations are very different. To an extent, it could be said, to a large extent, Satyajit Ray stayed within the framework of the middle class. But here is Mrinal Sen who enters the streets, the alleys, who enters the world of filth, blood, gore. But there is something very interesting in the film. Sumit, the protagonist, a revolutionary, Padatik, a guerrilla, begins to wonder if violence is the answer. Cannot give up violence, but when you look at atrocities, state brutality, as we have been noticing, especially the last one decade from 1914, oppressive brutality of the state, military, paramilitary, is violence the answer? But do you give up violence when you're crushed on all sides? So it's the story of introspection of this revolutionary, the Naxalite movement, wondering if this is very crucial, and this is, in my opinion, Mrinalda's daring with the Communist Party, CPI or CPM. And this is where I see some parallels with Adoorji's films, especially Mukhamukam and Kathapurushan. I'll come to that later. So this is the interesting part of how great filmmakers in India share their preoccupations, go through their preoccupations, but in different ways, in different formal structures. But the ethical concerns overlap. I don't say they merge, but they overlap, and leading to different levels of understanding. And here is this story of Padatik, of the revolutionary. It goes with the story of, again, very interesting, not at all surprising, with the story of a woman in the corporate world selling food, quality food. So poverty, squalid, hunger, starvation, the corporate world marketing food, but she has her personal crisis. So the story of the woman is central. The story of women, multiple stories of women are central to Mrinalda. So what is interesting for me is that the sense of history is so strong. His concern with liberty, fraternity, equality, justice is so strong that he doesn't just make it a public affair. It's not just part of the public space, the public realm, because we need to be inclusive, and being inclusive means bringing into perspective, proper perspective, the stories of those who don't matter, and these are women. So in Padatik, on one hand, you have the broad frames, historical frames. You enter the interior, the private realm, you have this story played by Simi Garewal of Sheila, dealing with her crisis, dealing with her broken marriage, dealing with her own anguish. And I'll stop here and then turn to the last part of my presentation. I can take about 5 minutes more. But what is interesting is the story of Sheila, the story of such women, are also stories that take us to Satyajit Ray's concern in Janaranya, the young girl pushed into prostitution, or the struggle of a woman in the private sphere. Say the stories of Nikhil, Sandeep, Bimala in Ghare Baire, how women handle their movement into history. So that's why I said at the beginning, I see a very fine relationship between these filmmakers, but to use that word again, that asymptotic, which means they run on parallel lines, suggesting the possibility of meeting perhaps at this point of infinity, if ever they do, but in very different ways. The last part of Padatik is very moving. Sumit comes home, the man who has abandoned home, his mother is dead. You see, this is where the Gandhian position, with the revolutionary position, with the Naxalite movement, underground. Now there's a very great metaphysical, philosophical, and I would even say spiritual juxtaposition. The father, a Gandhian, who has participated in the nationalist movement, mourning the death of his wife, tells him, you have your responsibility as the eldest son, but don't worry because the police are after you. Your brother Biru will do all that is necessary. And so this Gandhian says, the lines are go to war. So non-violence, ahimsa, swarajya, ahimsa, without which there was no notion of Indian independence, freedom for Gandhi. This Gandhian who has read Lenin he makes these statements. What were your party people doing? It's a direct attack, onslaught against the party, perhaps the Communist Party. We went on the roads, streets, fought. We knew, we challenged the British. But when the moment comes for him, the Naxalite thinks, the terrorist, the revolutionary thinks of the futility of violence but cannot give it up. The father, a Gandhian, talks of perhaps freedom is freedom post-independence. The contradiction is we have to think of freedom again as we are doing today, that we have to think of another kind of freedom. 75 years after that first struggle for independence, he says, perhaps violence is inevitable. So go to war, we will attend to the mother. It's a very moving movement. As moving as Adoorji's film. There's a confrontation there in Katha Purushan. I will leave it at that. Mrigaya, again, talking of rights, natural rights, but where are the rights of those who have been totally destroyed, decimated? The tribals, the Santal tribals. So, no Bhadralok here, no middle class, tribal question, oppressed by the colonial forces, the British are still there, and oppressed by the landowner. I don't know if Ronaldo had read Gopinath Mohanty. He has a monumental novel called Paraja, Stories of Mahashweta, and I'm sure Ronaldo had read, gone through all these, of oppression, double oppression, on the part of the state, the colonial state, and on the part of the money lender. What is a tribal to do? It's an ethical question. My point is, it's an ethical question for the Bhadralok, for bourgeoisie, for the middle class. Very easy to talk of non-violence, very easy to talk of ahimsa, but when the gun is there, point blank range, when your survival is at stake, when you're going to perish, when generations are going to perish, no support from any quarter, would we, people comfortably placed, safe, secure? This for me is the ethical question that Mrinalda raises. Who then has the right to talk of non-violence, ahimsa, as the absolute value? Now this is the open-ended manner in which this question is left before us. I'm reminded of the great philosopher, historian Isaiah Berlin, who talks of the liberal predicament. The liberal predicament is, if you believe in values of equality and justice, then you will not accept any kind of oppression, tyranny, especially state tyranny. But you can't challenge state tyranny, then what right have you to decry, to attack the violence of those who have nothing? Those who have been thrown into the gutters, those who have been driven into the forest, out of the forest. Now, these are ethical questions. The question that Herzog asked in Where the Green Ants Dream, his film on the Aborigines of Australia. So, Mrigaya is important for that reason. And very important, I will end it here. If there are questions later, I will take up later. Akaler Sandana, the reconstruction, meeting the famine. So here is this cinema crew, and as it happens in Ashani Sanket, again look at the parallels. Akaler Sandana, Ashani Sanket, at the present, to reconstruct the deadly famine and created by one of the worst monsters of human civilization, Winston Churchill, 1943. So these people go to film that 1943 famine, deadly famine. So they have to act. So the actor, man or woman, has to perform a role. But they use the villagers, and for them, it's a recreation of their miserable past. I haven't suffered, middle class hasn't suffered, the actors haven't suffered, privileged people with great entitlement, but we have to act. And the reconstruction of history is a painful existential negotiation for these people whose ancestors perished. So there are two stories of those who are trying to mimic. We are the mimic people. But for them, it's the anguish of the past which they haven't got rid of, which they can never get rid of from their consciousness. So this juxtaposition between the real and the film which is trying to capture that reality of history, for us it's not lived reality, for them it's lived reality. But I said I would stop here, but I must make a reference, at least one reference. Of course, Ek Din Pratidin, Adoorji has talked about, but courage. You know, those are those 1982, we had gone through Nishant, Ankur, but in courage, no protest, no shouting. It's the story of a child which is dead, choked to death because of carbon monoxide. The father comes, he sees that the child is dead. Conventional ending would mean protesting, blackmailing, shouting, but the kind of self-respect, going through death of the humbled, oppressed, traumatized, it's a matter of shame. For me, the film Courage is a monumental work which talks of the shame that we have to experience and we have to necessarily negotiate. But how are we going to negotiate? So the conventional stereotypes of the humbled, protesting, throwing stones, shouting, screaming, or blackmailing, or demanding just nothing. The gesture of saying, yes, yes, sir, we shall leave with such grace, with such dignity, self-respect. One is to show that the humble, the oppressed, the poor have their own self-respect, dignity. Beyond all these treacherous pits of modern history, and if there is any shame, and if there is any element of dignity left, still left for the middle class, it can only put its head down in shame. And this is not stated in very direct, dark, ugly terms. You must look at the restraint with which Mrinal narrates Courage. The final shot is where you're choked. When you look at those poor, miserable people, uneducated, illiterate, the child gone, just to say, this is human dignity. This is the fate, this is the destiny, and our fate, our destiny cannot be altered by our will. It's unhistorical to believe that the marginalized, that the oppressed will overthrow history and a new history will be born. That's too unrealistic, that is too stupidly romantic and unreal in historical terms. But to say, to bear, to suffer, to carry our cross without humiliation, without shame, and if there is any shame, it's the shame of the oppressor, especially of the middle class. So this has been just a synoptic overview of the significance of Mrinal, and as I said, very remarkable that, at least for me, three major filmmakers of our times. Satyajit Ray, and if I had time, I would have also gone to Ritvik Ghatak, but not much time. But I'm glad I was able to draw some references to Satyajit Ray and to Adoorji. Thank you so much.
I think by now you have entered into the spirit that I spoke about right at the beginning, how the same all Indian experience is something that we share with local histories, local passions, and how they can be shared without constructing any state-built or state-imposed oneness. What I propose to do is to just add a few footnotes, maybe, to what my very old and dear friends Adoor and Manu shared with you. And another little thing, I did a long interview with Mrinal Babu in 2001 when he had just started work on his last film, Amar Bhuban. I'll share with you some portions of this interview, my questions and his answers. And they will relate very closely to the points that Adoor and Manu made. Right at the beginning, my first question in this 2001 interview was, at that particular point of time when most of your friends were also slowly entering the world of cinema, what made you choose cinema? You're already in the toils of a certain political orientation. You had already embarked upon an activist political process. So what made you choose cinema? He answered, in a city like Calcutta, it is natural that everybody must have some sort of a political inclination. It is unavoidable. I too was very close to left radical politics for obvious reasons. And this resulted in my being familiar with its presence in the different media, print predominantly, and most important, in theatre. My interest in theatre grew rapidly as a consequence of my having watched the IPTA, the Indian People's Theatre Association plays. That was his answer, the entry point. And then something very interesting. I told you I'm just giving you footnotes to what Adoor and Manu said. A footnote to that wonderful moment at the end of Padatik, where the police are already after Sumit. There is even a hint, if you watch the film closely, that Sumit's leaders have exposed him to the police. They consider him a traitor, and they would rather hand him over to the police. The police are there waiting. That's hinted, that's suggested, that's there if you watch the film very closely. And at that point, the father, the Gandhian father who had been part of the nationalist movement, but significantly. And again, the point that I was making right at the beginning, that we bring in our readings, local readings, original readings, and readings from friends like Adoor and Manu from across our linguistic original borders. But for a Bengali viewer, the actor playing the father is Bijon Bhattacharya. Bijon Bhattacharya, who sparked off the IPTA theatre in Calcutta in 1943. Manu refers to 1943, the famine, and how Mrinal addresses it in Akali Shandhani, and Satyajit Rai addresses it in Ashwini Shankit. The 1943 famine. And I remember Bijon Bhattacharya telling me, sharing with me his experience every day as a journalist going to office every morning to take the tram. he had to pass from his home to the tram route a settlement of the famine-stricken who had come down from the villages and taken shelter in a park, which is still there in Calcutta. Every day he used to pass that park on the way to the tram route. And Vijayendra told me, I didn't have the guts. I didn't dare, in shame, in guilt, to look at them, dying there literally before our eyes, and we can't do anything about it. It's too large a problem. I never looked at them. I kept my eyes glued to the ground as I walked by. And one day, I overheard a couple talking, laughing, and talking about the last new harvest that gives the name to the plain of Anna. The last new harvest that they had enjoyed the year before. And how somebody teased somebody else when they were celebrating the harvesting. And somebody make a joke about somebody, and they laughed as they recalled those memories. 4 days later, Vijayendra was passing the same park, his eyes glued to the ground. He could see a dead body lying there, barely covered by a rag. And Vijayendra tells me, it suddenly struck me. It just could be that man who was laughing over the last year's new harvest. And I felt Vijayendra was not a theatre lover. Vijayendra didn't watch theatre. Vijayendra sang, Vijayendra wrote stories. Vijayendra was an active journalist who had traveled almost miles and miles and miles of Bengal. Never cared for theatre, never thought of theatre. He suddenly felt that they should speak for themselves. And if they have to speak, and they alone have the right to speak, it has to be theatre. Their voices must be turned to theatre. And let me try to do that. That's how N Manu comes into being. He writes N Manu. The first draft he reads out at a meeting at the headquarters in Calcutta of the Progressive Writers Association. And after his first reading, Samik Bandopadhyay walks up to him and says, how could you write it? The untranslatable Bengali words Manik Babu used, Samik Bandopadhyay. Apni to moshay jat chasha. And that is the greatest compliment that he remembered. When Samik Bandopadhyay tells me that you were a born farmer, born peasant, bloody peasant. That's what comes out from there. And now relate this. This Bijun Bhattacharya is the man with whom Mrinal Babu closes his film, who tells his son, they asked me to sign a bond in my office that I would never join a strike. I refused. And the words he says, the actual words, be brave. So when we watch Mrinal Sen's film, Mrinal Sen could have brought in any actor to play that role. Vijayendra doesn't have much to do with it. But all this goes onto the skin of the viewer. Locally, regionally, all that history we relive. when it's Pijunda's voice says, be brave. And you see the connection. He talks about IPTA that brings him into cinema. The next step, fascinating. He tells me the first script he wrote, not a film script. He couldn't tell me what it was, but a script. That's a word Mrinal Babu used in the interview. I wrote a script the first time. It was more of a prelude to a play. Without knowing anything about cinema, I had unconsciously incorporated certain cinematic features into it. The script was called Fight for Your Land. I had unconsciously incorporated certain cinematic features. I had thought about things, images in terms of close shot, long shot, moving the source of light either closer or further away, trying to superimpose images. I'd done all those things. I ask, was this produced? Yes. Not by IPTA directly, but by some other group. I was a part of it. And Tapas Sen, was involved too. Once, something very interesting happened, you know. We went to Rampur Hat. And he laughs, Mrinal Babu, and says, incidentally, therein lies entangled a matter of the heart too. Geeta, too, had gone there with her group. So there we were, Tapush and I in Rampur Hat, and Geeta. There was a power failure. What would we do for the lights? Tapush suggested, what about the light of a bicycle? That can surely serve as a source of light. So I told Tapush, well, if that's what you're going to do, we can use the varying speeds of the bicycle to monitor the amount of light. And if we can get hold of another bicycle, when one dims, the other can get brighter. We can use that very effectively for superimposition. One can fade out while the other fades in. It won't be possible for us to achieve this in any other way. He was quite taken with the idea, and he did it with his professional imagination and effort. So you see, with experiences like these, I was growing, the horizon was expanding, and I was moving into cinema. The IPTA and the Communist Party was banned in 1948 and remained banned till 1951. I was very close to the party, its people and its activities. Even when the party was banned and during its underground phase, I was treated as a member. I was even a go-between for all sorts of correspondence. When they did their posters, the dumping of these posters between the writing and the pasting was a very tricky job. The police would come and raid the place whenever they wished. So where could one dump them? That became my responsibility. His involvement in the party, in the movement, at the same time, the point that Manu was making so brilliantly, A footnote again. Uh, sorry. Being with the party, not as a member, retaining his independence, retaining his individual way of looking at things, and being engaged with the values, with the vision. I ask, Mrinal Babu, to return to where we began this morning, you mentioned that when you began work, you adopted or were exposed to a radical left position, and hence that was your starting point. When in the 1980s, in the larger political sphere, in the international sphere, things began to slowly give way until 1990, when we have the dissolution of the Soviet Union. How does this affect you? Because so far it has been very evident, even when we were talking about Padatik, that entire history, with its contradictions, that you have never regarded your left radical position with undue reverence and admiration. Your criticality has always been there. Despite that, and it stops me. Yes, in Padatik I've tried to make this whole thing politically valid. Very few people have noticed I have used consciously Mao Zedong's 1926 speech at Canton, and he quotes Mao. Before that, he gives you the name of the speech, The Analysis of Classes in Chinese Society. I never mentioned the name because the censor board would never have allowed it. But I made Dhritimant Chatterjee speak the exact words, and he quotes, all our revolutions have come to naught because we have not been able to distinguish our friends from our foes. Something we must have done right at the beginning, unquote. This, in a way, I've tried to say in Padatik. I say, you make a political statement then. I've tried to be vocal about the ideology of our times, try to take a firm stand. Another footnote. I ask, post Baishis Rabun and up to Akash Kushum, you made two films which I personally consider very significant, Punushcho and Pratinidhi. What were you trying to explore at that particular point of time? In Baishis Rabun, a historical situation, the famine and the experience of the famine, and how it completely shakes up the foundations of human relationships. It doesn't remain a mere historical fact, but gets socialized somehow. Mrinal Babu adds, without showing the physicality of famine, I say, all this you bring into Baishas Rabun. Then you move to the space of the middle class family. Family relationships, the individual, new values coming in and getting resisted, something that Bengali films had avoided for some time. These are the issues that one can pursue up to Punoshcho and Pratinidhi. What were you trying to do? Nothing beyond that. I was merely trying to shake up the prevalent and somewhat stagnant middle class values. We seem to have fallen asleep over these values. They become static. I wanted to shake them up out of the torpor, startle, surprise, contest them if necessary. This is what I've tried to do in my own small way in both these films. I haven't done anything more, I believe. I say, in a way, Akash Kushum, apart from the technical and stylistic elements which at that time had a certain shock effect, was thus resisted by many people. I personally welcomed it for being gimmicky. Why not? This is one aspect of it. On the other hand, the trappings of realism in the film, the story, the relationships that unfold and develop, even clash against each other, break away from the structures of realism and move towards more of an abstraction in terms of film language. There is a desire, a dream of success in life and career, and success in love. The two are almost linked, linked to weave a fantasy, and then try to lift that fantasy. The plot, predominant in realism, with the psychological relationships, slow developments, packages, cleavages. You break away from all of this and more daringly towards a level of abstraction in your film. This aspect appeared to me to be much more striking than the technical, call it gimmicky or whatever you like. And he answers, it is not that I got from Truffaut, although his films did help me a lot. Just one last quote from this interview. And again a footnote. And after this footnote, I'll just take 5 minutes to make one or 2 points. I ask him, what I'm trying to say is that though you have been aware of this, when between the 1980s and 1990s, the left actually collapses, then can you still hold on to your agenda of examining history, social change, and even relationships from a left radical position? A pattern that emerges consistently from your film so far? Or do you now seek something else? He answers, excellent answer, really. I'd like to say something else first. I could see that there was something wrong somewhere. This was soon after the 1977 elections, when the left forces won with an overwhelming majority. That is when I realized that we were looking at imminent disaster. At a completely different level, I was making a film about the rural proletariat, about Kishu and Madhab. Footnote again, this is the film with which Manu started, Kafan. And there's something even more interesting. Premchand wrote 2 stories. One in 1923 or 24 called Shatranj Ke Khiladi, about 2 idlers in an affluent situation where he brings in elements of social tension in one way, and another, Kafan. I based my film O Kauri Kotha on this. Was an exploration of another extreme of society. 2 idlers, again, in absolute poverty. I found that to be very interesting. And also the connection that Manu was making, Shatranj, 2 idlers, and Okaurikotha two idlers, Ray and Mrinal Sen. I received the news of this landslide victory while shooting Okaurikotha. Calcutta was apparently ablaze with lights, and that's when I realized that despite all the promises made, they'd actually failed to deliver the goods. That's also when I thought that instead of pointing my finger at the enemy outside, I should point my finger at the enemy inside me. That's when I began making films about my own community. And that is when I started doing films like Actin Pratidin. I deliberately underscored the inherent flaws in our inherently flawed selves. And when people asked me why I was making films like this, I said that it had now become imperative for us to recognize ourselves, identify the faults, understand the lapses. If we could identify the enemy outside, perhaps the land reform movement would have been even more successful, though there is no connection between the two, except that if you are a better person, then automatically you have a better chance at making a movement a success. Otherwise, everything we attempt will be doomed to failure. A last footnote. Right now, I'm busy. As you know, that I'm not a film critic or a writer or anything of the kind. I'm a publisher's editor. I make books. And the book that I'm working on is the third volume of the collection of Soumitra Chatterjee's prose writings. And the last footnote, in one of his pieces, which will appear in this volume, hoping to publish in October, Soumitra writes at one point, Satyajit Ray rang him up one day and said, "Don't miss Okaurikotha. I envy Mrinal for that." Thank you.
I would like to thank you, our panelists, for the wonderful inputs that they have shared with us and the experience too. Now we would like to take a few questions from the audience. Volunteers, kindly help me circulating the mics.